Hi everybody, and welcome to week 3 on the evolution of social rights, especially from the mid-19th to the early 20th century. Here's our list of learning objectives for the week, which I'll go through in turn over the following slides. Reading 1 is a brief edited excerpt from this classic mid-20th century essay by the British sociologist T.H. Marshall. He argues that, with the expansion of capitalism and the systematic change from servile to free labor, there is a correlating expansion in the development of citizenship rights, particularly in England. Civil rights was the first category that consolidated in the long 18th century. In addition to securing individual freedoms, this expansion of civil rights also included the right to work, thereby corresponding with the capital-driven demand for a cheap, mobile labor force. Yet by securing certain civil rights, this in turn led to the demand for political rights, which slowly caught up over the 19th century through reform efforts and the gradual expansion of enfranchisement. This in turn led to the expansion of social rights in the 20th century, which was when the idea took hold that citizens should have a modicum of welfare and security to enjoy all their other rights. So in sum, use reading 1 to think about how the history of rights can be categorized and periodized. What do you think of Marshall's evolutionary model? Reading 2 is by American political scientist Micheline Ishay, who, in addition to publishing a wonderful edited volume on the history of human rights, from which we drew Reading 1 actually, but she's also published an important monograph on the history of human rights as well. So our chapter from this latter book deals with the question about whether or not, or to what extent, or in what ways, socialism has made a lasting contribution to the legacy of human rights. Now, Reading 2 is a bit long, it's almost 50 pages, because the author provides a lot of historical context regarding the Industrial Revolution and the corollary social and political struggles of the long 19th century. So if you decide to read this selection, don't get hung up on all of the details, right? Just follow the author's general trajectory. But if you want to get a finer look at the details in this complex historical mosaic, be sure to follow your interest and read a selection or two more closely. Reading 3 is by Susan Marks, a professor of international law at the London School of Economics, and it starts by tracing a genealogy of the English phrase, the rights of man, back to a struggle against landlords in the late 18th century. In true genealogical fashion, the author reminds us that there's no straight line between this historical struggle and the contemporary human right to adequate housing, for example. Rather, she explores how this phrase became vernacularized when it did, and under what conditions. So the rest of her book shows how a heated controversy over the rights of man coincided with the final enclosure of common lands and the momentous changes associated with early industrialization. Tracking back still further to 16th and 17th century writing about dispossession, resistance, and rights, the book also situates the history of human rights within a forgotten or marginalized tradition of social critique and activism. Reading 4 is by a scholar of international and comparative law, legal theory, and legal history, Eric Engel, who reviews the standard Marxist critique of human rights. In order to understand this critique, you first have to appreciate the premise of historical materialism, the key idea of which, as far as we're concerned, is that the ideologies, values, and belief systems that comprise the so-called superstructure of society are designed to reflect the political economic structure of that society. So things like art, culture, religion, law, including rights, as well as science and education, all of that is used to maintain or justify the relations of production, according to this theory. So if religion is the opiate of the masses, like Marx famously said, then so too are rights, again according to this critique, which is concerned that the overbearing focus on individual civil and political rights comes at the expense of social and economic rights. And this idea is known as the displacement thesis, and we'll come back to it later this semester, particularly in week 7 on neoliberalism and globalization. The other key idea I want you to take away from this critique is the difference between formal and substantive equality. The classical liberal approach to individual civil and political rights ensures formal equality before the law, but that's not reflected in any substantive equality. In any case, the main idea here is to just analyze the Marxist critique of liberalism and rights. Finally, Reading 5 is by Canadian legal scholar Patrick Macklem, who specializes in international law, comparative law, legal theory, as well as Canadian constitutional law and Indigenous rights. We'll be reading further selections from this book, which argues that the purpose of international human rights law is to mitigate the adverse effects of how international law deploys sovereignty. and by extension, the political economic structures defined by the capitalist world system. It's in this latter sense that concerns our selection here, which introduces the legal regime built around the International Labour Organization, or the ILO, which is an international organization that began with the League of Nations before being folded into the UN. The ILO is responsible for producing and promoting a number of international treaties related to labor rights. Once again, this chapter covers a lot of detail, but skip towards the final section to get the gist of his argument, which he sums up on page 95. International labor rights, he says, like other social and economic rights, are instruments that address the fact that international law authorizes states to exercise sovereign power in ways that threaten the interests that such rights seek to protect. In other words, international labor rights bring a measure of legitimacy to a global system that's responsible for threatening those very rights. So what do you make of this argument, and how does it relate to the other arguments that we've seen this week? Okay, and that's pretty much it. So in addition to our weekly discussion forum, you also need to email me about your final paper, whether you're selecting your own topic or you just want to do a synthetic essay. So let me know. In any case, thanks for listening, and I'll see you next time.